7 years into my illness, I learned that a surgery might help me. Now, since I'd spent the last 7 years confined to a hospital bed in my living room, this was amazing news. But there was a problem. No good surgery existed. And the surgery that did exist would give me a new disease. Now, doctors take an oath to do no harm. So the idea of giving a patient a new disease in the hopes that it's better than the one they have is not very appealing. And frankly, after all I'd been through, I didn't want another disease either. So I was in a trap. Calling the surgeons wouldn't get me the surgery, but not calling the surgeons wouldn't get me the surgery either. So what was left? Well, I decided that if I needed a surgery and there wasn't one, then I'd invent one. Now, I wasn't a surgeon or a doctor. I was a homebound, disabled college dropout. So how does a patient get to the point where he truly believes his best path forward is to develop his own surgery? Well, to understand that, we have to go back 7 years. In 1999, when I was 21, I got sick. I had just finished my junior year in college, and I was starting a summer biochemistry research position at the University of Kansas. And that's when I came down with what the doctors told me was mono. But after months of rest, I had to leave that position and just go home. But after months of rest, I didn't get better. I got worse. I had to drop out of school. I made it to one day of my senior year, and I had to come home. And so then I became homebound. And I ended up spending the next 11 years homebound and bedbound. Basically, I could stand for about the length of a commercial break, and I could walk for about 50 feet. And if I overdid by overrunning those limits or even eating the wrong kind of meal, my heart would race and the room would spin, and I would get painful cramping muscles. Sometimes you could put a piece of loose leaf paper on my chest and watch it flutter because my heart was pounding that hard. I could do something like eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and get a heart rate of 140 while laying down for 2 hours. So my life became a disaster. I started going to see doctors, and I saw doctor after doctor, and they couldn't tell me what was wrong or what would help. So my first job was boxing, and when I was 16, was boxing up orders at a fly fishing mail order catalog. The guy had started this shop when he got back from Korea, and he didn't want to have just a one-room shop and struggle. And he said to me, and so he added this mail order business back in the late 50s. And so he would write the catalog himself, and he taught me fly tying. And while he would do that, he would teach me other things too. And one of the things he said to me is, if you want to make what everyone else makes, you can do what everyone else does. But if you want to make something different, you're going to have to do something different. Now, he was talking about business, but I was applying it now to my situation. If I just kept seeing doctors and just kept asking them for help and they just kept striking out, I'd still be in the same boat. And so I decided to sort of change the script. And I decided I would take the lead and tackle my problem like a scientist. I wasn't going to rely on crystals or something to make things better. I would work with the medical community, but where we got stuck, I would try and use the tools of a scientist to get us over the hump and get us moving again. And so there I was at home, and I didn't know what to do, and so I started reading. And I read 1,000 and 2,000-page medical texts, endocrinology, pharmacology, physiology texts, and I was looking for something. I figured that what I had was likely rare, because if it was common, the doctors would have seen it. They would have found it. And so it took me about a year until I came up with something. And I saw a few tidbits that I started to piece together, and I theorized that there was likely an entire class of disorders devoted to dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. This was a complicated system, and there was a chance it would malfunction. And so basically, the autonomic nervous system controls heart rate, blood pressure, metabolism, digestion, all of these things below your level of conscious control. And I contended that if it was malfunctioning, we would see problems with heart rate, blood pressure, metabolism, and digestion. Problems like we were seeing in me. So I prepared what I had, and I pulled together my little bibliography, and I went to the doctors, and I said, I think this is something. And they said to me, problems like you describe don't exist. And I said, but they could. See, doctors practice from experience. So the idea that a patient has come into their office and brought this idea that there's a class of disorders they don't routinely treat and that they don't know anyone who specializes in treating, it sounds absurd. But I was tackling this like a scientist. So to me, the idea that there was a complex system in the body, but that nothing could go wrong with it, that sounded absurd. If you went to your mechanic and you said, I'm having trouble with my headlights, and he said, well, maybe it's the wires, maybe it's the fuses, maybe it's, that's plausible. But if he said, headlights don't have problems, how would that sit with you? So that was our stalemate. They went on with their lives, and I went back to my hospital bed. And it took another 9 months until I got a computer with internet access. And I was able to, within a month, I was able to find a nonprofit devoted to the kinds of problems I'd theorized existed and were told did not. And it turns out that disorders of the autonomic nervous system are called dysautonomias. So the nonprofit sent me some literature, and I started reading. And by that time, my friends had graduated and gone on to med school. So now I could go on to Medline and pull up information and send citations to my buddies, and they could send me the PDFs back. And if I couldn't get them that way, I would write the authors themselves, and they would send them. And so I started reading and reading. And within 18 months, I'd come up with something. I'd come up with a possible treatment for my own condition, and I was invited to present a short paper at an international medical conference devoted to dysautonomias. And so I was going as a scientist, but I was still a patient, and it was sometimes hard to separate those. I had a job to do, but I'd been sick for 3 years. And the first time I met an autonomic investigator, I cried. I mean, it was at lunch, so I didn't want to, but this was the first time I'd been in a room full of people who knew that I was right. And so I gave my presentation, and it went very well. But I hadn't gone there to just make a mark and give a presentation and come home with a little laurel or something. I was a 24-year-old college dropout in a reclining wheelchair who had a proposed treatment for my own condition, and I needed somebody to work with. And I came home empty-handed. And that was a problem. So I was stuck. And it took me another 18 months to find an autonomic expert to work with. By that point, I'd been sick for 5 years. But this is Dr. H. Cecil Coughlin. He ran the Autonomic Nervous System Laboratory at University of Alabama, Birmingham. And you can tell from the picture, he's excited, he's engaged, and he wanted to work with me. He was a pioneer and a genius and a great gentleman. And finally, we got a chance to work together. And so I got to travel to I got to travel to Birmingham. We rented an SUV and laid me on a mattress. And I just had to go limp in the back and go for this 500-mile ride. Because I noticed right away, even the turns in the highway, if you're laying on the mattress, there's pressure on you. And if I were to tense up and try and go against that, I'd have been exhausted by the time I got there. So I just had to lay limp and sort of roll a bit for this entire trip. We got there, and Dr. Coughlin's testing showed I had a very severe autonomic problem, which was good news because at least now we knew what was going on. We knew something. We had made more progress than we'd made in the last 5 years. And Dr. Coughlin also helped me try my proposed treatment. It was a new use for the drug Levophed. And anyone in here that knows probably knows it by its jingle, which is Levophed leaves them dead. It's an ICU drug that they often use on sepsis patients. And I was contending at a lower dose that it could be helpful to me in a home infusion. And it was quite risky. The director of clinical research at Vanderbilt said, if you do it wrong, it will kill you. And I was clear with Dr. Coughlin, just as he knew. We talked about that. And he said, well, we'll start slow and we'll start low and we won't do it wrong. And that's what I thought too. So that's what we did. Now, it stabilized my condition, so it did work. I was able to keep going and keep working, but I was still very sick. And it took Dr. Coughlin and I almost another 1.5 years to figure out exactly what was going on. But I eventually got a scan that showed that the center of my adrenal gland was misbehaving. Basically, I had one of two conditions. I had either primary hyperepinephrinemia or adrenal medullary hyperplasia. Now, these are very rare conditions. So we've had 45 presidents, but worldwide, I could only find 32 cases of adrenal medullary hyperplasia, and I could only find 5 of the other. So statistically, you're more likely to be elected president than to be diagnosed with either of these conditions. So when you're on the phone and you're jawing with folks, this is quite a mouthful. And so in the end, we just started calling it Lindsay syndrome, because that was my last name. But either way, there was good news. The middle of my adrenal gland was dumping too much adrenaline into my blood, and I was hypersensitive to it. And if we could remove that tissue, my life should get better. The problem was that the bad tissue was holding the good tissue hostage. See, you need an adrenal cortex to live because it makes steroid hormones. And the only surgery that existed would pull the whole gland. And if we pull both of my adrenal glands, we've just given me a new disease. So there was a chance a surgery could help me, but there was also no surgery. And that's when I decided if I needed one and there wasn't one, I'd invent one. So how do you invent a surgery? Well, I wasn't sure. One of the doctors in the field described it as trying to cut the peanut butter out of a peanut butter sandwich and leave the bread. He called it a nearly impossible task. And the reason it was nearly impossible is it's not as big as a sandwich. So that is my thumb, that is a nickel, and that is 11 slices of human adrenal gland. And it's 2 different tissue types, and we need to take out the middle of those. So that was the challenge. I needed an impossible surgery, but it was still my best chance. And so for a year, I started digging, and I came up with nothing. It was, people believed it was impossible. And a year in, I got what I thought was a big break. It turned out the surgery I needed was possible in rats. So a biology professor had developed this surgery and done it in 1980 in Georgia State on rats. And I called him, and he said he used a razor blade to slice into the gland and then gently squeezed it until the middle popped out like a pimple. Well, when I brought that to the head of endocrine surgery at University of Chicago, he was not impressed. And his opinion held across the field. So I kept digging. And then I found that the surgery I needed had been done in cats at Harvard in 1926. And so I got all of these old articles. I started working with the History of Science department there. And I got these old articles, and basically Walter Bradford Cannon, who has a mountain named after him, had done this surgery. And he spent in one article half a page explaining how he accidentally invented the beer bong, and only half a sentence on how he did the surgery that might save my life. So he didn't give us enough to go on. And so I kept digging. And I found that the surgery had been done in dogs in Oregon in 1940. And again, taking the model I used at Harvard, I started working with their medical librarians and their historians there. And they couldn't figure out how it was done either. But a librarian named Sarah Piasecki at Oregon helped me dig. And we found that this had originally been done in Argentina in 1923. Now that's the year before The Great Gatsby was published. And the guy who did it was a Nobel Prize winner named Bernardo Houssay. And here's how he described it. He said he cut into the adrenal gland with a sharp Gillette blade and then opened it like a book. And then he scraped out the middle with a small, hard spoon and sewed it back up. And that was the whole surgery. And so I was stunned, and I brought this information to the doctors, and they'd been losing yardage the whole time, from impossible to, well, maybe rats, well, maybe cats, well, dogs, but I still can't imagine how. And so that was good, but the doors still didn't just swing open. It took me another 18 months to build a team to do it. And I deferred to his clinical expertise, but head of surgical oncology at University of Alabama, Birmingham, decided to use the Da Vinci surgical robot instead of a spoon. So I get this surgery, and we don't even know whether it's worked, because I wake up and my life is still kind of the same. And there was a nonprofit called Wings of Hope. They're an aviation humanitarian nonprofit. And they put me, after 11 years in bed, I was just very sick. And my back hurt too bad to travel by car anymore. It hurt too bad to buy multiple airline seats and lay across them like I'd done initially, years earlier. And so they put me on a stretcher in a private medical flight in a plane that feels like a hot water heater. And they flew me to Birmingham and back for free. And when I came home, I was safe, but we didn't know whether it worked. And so it took about 3 weeks, and then my body started to change. And all of a sudden, instead of being able to sit for about the length of a meal, I was able to sit for 3 hours. And I started being able to walk a little further. And so I would go out at night because I walked so slowly, and I would try and walk a little more. And so on the day of the surgery, I'd been able to walk 50 feet. But by the end of that was in September. And by the end of the year, I could walk a couple of miles. And so on Christmas Eve in 2010, I walked out of my house in the snow and I walked to midnight mass. And I stood in the back. There's a lot of churches near my house, but this one was walking distance. And so I stood in the back of this church that I'd been through many times growing up, and I just was able to stand for the duration of the mass. There was just tears streaming down my face. And I walked home in the snow. I made a snowball, threw it at nothing, And my neighbor once said to me that a miracle is only a miracle, if you can't explain it. Well, the explanation is, after 11 years homebound and bedbound, I took a long-forgotten 90-year-old dog surgery and turned it into a modern human surgery. We built a team to pull it off, and it took me from wheelchair to walking. To me, that still sounds like a miracle. So I recovered, but I plateaued, and I had to get a second surgery. And that took almost 2 years, because, again, new continues to take time. New in medicine is always a challenge. And so I got that surgery, and recovering from it was a challenge. But I did. And in the course of my work, I developed new uses for 5 existing prescription drugs, as well as the 2 innovative surgeries. It was a success. We were able to leave behind enough adrenal cortex that I'm not adrenal insufficient. So that was amazing. And then I recovered enough. I spent this was 14 years in all. I wrote a book. It's too long. I didn't publish it yet, but it exists. And then I became a speaker, and I went back to school. And so now, in addition to speaking, I'm setting up shop as a personal medical consultant, because there are other people who get stuck in the medical system and don't have any answers. And so I'm hoping that I can take the skills I learned in building medical teams and in sort of kicking over rocks to uncover what's there, and in supporting both doctors and patients and developing communication means to try and get these messages across, that I can help other people that are stuck in the system. And I can pour hundreds of hours of effort and sophistication into a problem when the medical system can provide tens of minutes of a doctor's time. And so that just order of magnitude jump and that level of effort, I think we can get some interesting things done and lay down what is sort of a best practice for how do you tackle what seems to be intractable. So the next thing I was going to talk about was hope. But after being here for a few days, David on the first day talked to you guys about, look for a mentor. And then I guess Greg yesterday was talking about how to be one of those. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about my relationship with some of the doctors that helped. So a guy named E.D. Pellegrino was chairman of the President's Council on Biomedical Ethics. And he was a Georgetown professor, and so he was basically George W. Bush's bioethicist. And he became my primary bioethics advisor for 5 or 6 years. And I had a whole suite of phone numbers for each institute and center that he would work at to try and find him. But if I could catch him, he would spend the time with me to talk about how do we talk about what's new to doctors in a way that they're open to hearing it, in a way that's ethical. If you ask a stockbroker for an inside trading tip, your relationship's over. It's the same with medicine. So how does a patient develop the skill to be able to talk about these things in a way that gets it done? Well, he helped me with that. There was another guy named Manny Bravo, and he was the adrenaline tumor screener for the Cleveland Clinic. And years later, when I was healthy, my primary care doctor tried to reach him by phone, and she couldn't. He just didn't call her back. I think she called a couple times. She got nothing. And so that's when it dawned on me. At one point when I was sick, I called him, and his assistant patched me through to his cell phone. And he took the time to listen and give me some advice. And it turned out he was in the airport waiting to fly back to the Philippines to see his family. But he was willing to make time to give me these small pieces of information that turned out to be game changers. And when Dr. Coughlin retired, this new use for Levophed that was keeping me stable was in jeopardy because it was such a dramatic treatment and such a departure from how it's usually used that we didn't know who would help me. And a local doctor stepped up. He had been a Soviet fighter pilot. And just like we saw yesterday with Nicole, he had spent time thinking about heart rates and blood pressures from all this time thinking about G-forces, that he was more comfortable managing my condition and my heart rate and blood pressure this way than almost any other doctor would. So this local guy whose office was in a strip mall just came in and offered help I couldn't get anywhere else. But all those guys are doctors and surgeons, and none of us in this room maybe have ever written a prescription for a patient. But the medical librarians, the medical historians, the cell biologists that helped me, they weren't prescribing treatments. They were just there for me. And they told me what it was, how hospitals worked, or how graduate school worked, or how these medical research works. Because I'm just stuck at home, and they kept me in the game. And so I would call this guy Ken Bloomer, who was a cell biologist at Washington University. And I would call him with a question in mind that I thought was the next step. And then I'd feel like the dumbest man in the world when I hung up the phone. Because I was facing this way, and I said he would spin my hat around and send me out in the other direction. But that was the right direction. And so coaching is often about pulling from people the answers that are within them. But he knew there were things I just didn't know. So if my questions were wrong, we could talk about it, but then he would tell me where he thought I ought to be facing. And I might have felt like an idiot when I hung up the phone for being so far off, but when I went in to talk to the doctors, it worked. So any of you in this room can be a Ken Bloomer. And that's about the nicest thing I could say about anybody. So in the end here, I want to talk about the role of hope in problem solving. Because people say things like, hope is not a strategy, hope is not a method. People think hope is a bad word sometimes. But I want to talk to you about what hope is and isn't so that we can use it. So hope is the belief that something positive can happen. Dictionaries have long definitions that are wrong. They basically say hope is the desire for and the expectation of fulfillment of something. And that's specific hope. That's like I hope I get into Yale. And it's a trap for 3 reasons. It sets you up for failure if you don't get it. But it also blinds you to gratitude, to the positive things that happen every day that are short of your goal. And it blinds you to the chance for success that is bigger than your goal. When you have this myopic, specific hope focus, it's not what you need to tackle big problems. You need this. So I want to show you through my story in 2 instances of where hope played a role. I needed a surgery. There wasn't one. I spent a year looking. And basically, the best information I was able to come up with after a year, my breakthrough was this. The surgery was possible in rats, according to these articles and this biology professor, and the best human surgeons in the world told me it was not possible in people. So it would have been perfectly logical for me to take all of that information and to come to this conclusion. Lucky rats. If I was a rat, I could have the surgery I needed. If I was a rat, I could get better. Lucky rats. There's no flaw in that logic. That is absolutely fact-based, based on the best information we have. Now what happens when you inject hope into that scenario? We took something that was categorically impossible, and now it was possible in rats. And I say, what are the chances that this is a fluke, that this thing that people think is impossible is possible in rats and nowhere else, nothing else? So to me, that was a driver. To the doctors, it was like, everything gives rats cancer. Let's go on with our day. This is not transformative. But I kept digging. And what I came up with was it was possible in rats, and then it was possible in cats. And so to do research on a person, you have to go in front of an institutional review board and get funding and all of this. And to do research on an animal, it's the same. You've got to go in front of an institutional review board. The only difference is the animal doesn't have to be better off at the end. But when talking with my ethicists, something that's deceased is no longer an animal subject. So I reached out to a veterinary pathologist at Mizzou, and I asked him to do the rat surgery on a cat because we couldn't find out how it had been done. And so he tried it. And so that's the scalpel he used, and he was able to take the medulla from the cortex by slicing into it and squeezing it like a pimple. Now that was awesome, and everybody wanted to see the pictures. And so I sent him off. But the very next day, he tried the same surgery on a small, freshly dead pig, and it failed. I talked to my comparative anatomy expert at the University of Minnesota, who is, again, not a doctor, just a PhD, and he says to me, rat and cat adrenals are fatty, and human and pig adrenals have more connective tissue. The texture's different, and that's why it didn't work. So from that information, it was perfectly plausible for me to come back to the same conclusion. Everybody's right, lucky rats. But the way I looked at it was, this is possible in a 9-ounce rat and a 9-pound cat. And then I found the dog study. And now so we're at 60 pounds, which is the size of a fourth grader. And so each step of the way, hope was necessary. It wasn't just what was the turning point and why were you so hopeful. It was always hopeful. I want to leave you with this. When you face problems, you are going to have an orientation. What is it? If you were a college athlete, you might be very confident about physical challenges. But what about an interpersonal one? If you don't choose your mindset, what will it be? And will it always be the same? So when I face a problem, I have to choose to face, if I want to solve it, I choose to face it with hope. And when I start there, it doesn't change the facts, and it doesn't change the likelihood that something will happen, but it does change your assessment of things and your assessment of what's possible. And when you do that, it can mean everything. You can end up living a life that's the equivalent of lucky rats and having no idea that there was something else right there. So if you leave with anything, leave with this. Hope is the belief that something positive can happen. And that is the first step to solving any problem. Thank you.